I'll talk, but we can all check out the chat as I talk or at the end. So thanks again for having me here. I'm excited for a couple of reasons. This is a topic that's close to my heart. I work a lot on how nature and cities interact. And it's also a group that I'm really interested to meet. I will be, for personal reasons, relocating to the Basel area in the summer. So continuing to work for the Nature Conservancy in my current job, but just in a different place. And so I'm delighted to talk to this group and hope I can meet some of you in person. So my talk is about why nature is essential for cities. And I want to start my talk by showing you this picture. So this is what the Earth really looks like at night from space. And I love this picture because at the top, you can actually see the International Space Station. So this was taken by some astronauts on the International Space Station. And you're looking down towards Italy. Mostly what you see is the boot of Italy, but you can probably see Zurich there as well, if you look carefully. So we live on this very urban planet, and it's important to realize how new that is. So for most of our history, we lived in mostly rural areas or small settlements. It was only, depending on how you measure, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that a majority, 51% of people lived in urban areas. And we're heading towards a world where about 80% of people, 75 to 80% of people will be in cities. So in our lifetimes, by 2050, there will be another 2 billion people in cities. And so the way to think about how fast that is picture everything you know about Zurich, say, and all the roads and bridges and buildings, and picture building that in basically 2 days. And then doing that over and over and over again out to 2050. That's the pace of urban building globally. And of course, it's not all playing out in one place. It's playing out in cities all around the world. But it's a huge transformation of the human landscape. And it has huge implications for many aspects of how we relate to the environment, right? Greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and also our own happiness. So I'm going to touch on many of those topics today. But the main context for my talk is a picture like this, and trying to understand what is the role of conservation? What is the role of a group like World Wildlife Fund or the Nature Conservancy in a world that's fundamentally mostly urban? And I just thought I'd give you some pictures of what that urban area growth looks like over time. About 1.2 million new square kilometers of urban area by 2030 compared to 2000, I guess, which was the baseline for this picture. So that's the size of a good-sized country, right? The size of the United Kingdom, say, I think. You can see a lot of the growth is happening in Africa and Asia, particularly China and India. The US and Europe and Japan urbanized earlier. We're already predominantly urban societies, but developing countries are catching up fast. And so those are places where, as conservationists, we are starting to focus. How do you manage the growth and make those cities more sustainable in those places? Not to say there's not also big things we have to do in Europe and the US to make our cities more sustainable as well. So I wanted to start maybe on or offer a personal note here, because I got into conservation not because of cities, but because of places like this. So I am from the south of the United States, from a state called North Carolina. And this is some of the pine savannas that we have in North Carolina, which are these beautiful systems where there's basically one species of tree here, longleaf pine, but then hundreds of grass species and sedge species within a square meter. So it's a very biodiverse system, fire maintained system. And the Nature Conservancy, where I work now, has a preserve here that I worked on when I was in university and sort of fell in love with wild spaces. And so this, of course, is still part of what conservation groups like WBFF and the Nature Conservancy do, is protect these wild spaces, and we'll keep doing that. But over time, I wanted in my career to understand conservation and sustainability where most of us live. And where most of us live is not places like this. Unfortunately, it often looks like this. This is a picture from Los Angeles in the US. This is the Los Angeles River. And it is sort of the poster child of a river that has lost all of its ecological functioning. So this river has been totally channelized, it's concrete lined for much of its length, and it's serving as a stormwater conveyance system. So when it rains hard, that stormwater flushes out to the coast very quickly. This was a very typical mentality in 1940s, 1950s, 1960s in cities around the world, was to view, to solve for one problem and to solve for it with a lot of concrete. So I could talk about, why this was bad for the biodiversity that used to live in the Los Angeles River, why it was bad for the fish, for example. But I think there's also something bad for us humans who are living in a space like this. It is sort of gray and depressing. In the summer, it's extremely hot. And in the Los Angeles area, this has also become sort of a forgotten space. So if anyone's seen the Terminator movie, for example, this is where there are all these battles and gangs hang out there. So if that 1.2 million square kilometers of urban area means more spaces like this, that to me is a really depressing view of our future as a species. I think that's what scares my colleagues and I at the Nature Conservancy. But yet you see cities thinking differently about rivers and about nature. So this is a river in Seoul, and they've taken what used to be a very gray space that looked a lot like the Los Angeles River. In fact, it was worse because it had a highway on top of it. And they have turned it into this beautiful green park. This is the Cheonggyecheong River in Seoul. And so this is still the floodwater conveyance area for the city. So at the flood stage, everyone has to get out of this area. But you can see it's a place for recreation, a place for a mental break. It is cooler on a hot day. And so we're going to talk about why that's important more and more as climate change makes our cities hotter. And it also is driving tourism and economic development to this part of the city, which is both a blessing and a curse sometimes. So people like myself, ecologists, are getting asked to help cities plan spaces like this. And that's really different than when I started my career almost 20 years ago now. 20 years ago, the mentality was protecting nature from cities, and we're still doing that. But now we're also getting asked to conserve nature for cities. And it's a shift, and it involves collaboration more between ecologists and conservationists and urban planners and engineers. It's a very different mentality. All right, so I wanted to first offer some very positive words about cities, because it's easy in a talk like this to talk about the difficulties with that mass urbanization and not focusing on the positive. People around the world are moving to cities because they are enormous engines for economic growth and productivity and creativity. So the patent generation is faster in cities, human interactions are faster in cities, we walk faster, economic growth is quite a lot faster in cities. So those are some of the reasons why so many billions of people are moving to cities. And economists talk about this kind of dryly as agglomeration economics, right? Or the benefits to production of being in cities. And I thought I would say a few words about those, just to give you a sense of what's driving this mega trend towards cities. So sometimes they classify them in these three categories, which I quite like. So sharing is about sharing infrastructure, like this picture of the port in Singapore. Infrastructure is very expensive. And when multiple people, multiple firms can use it, you get a lot of efficiencies. And that's true whether it's a port or a railroad or a highway or a river or whatever. The second way cities are powerful and drive economic growth is through what's sometimes called matching. Okay, so when people, especially in one industry, move together in the same place, it becomes easier for specialized jobs, workers with specialized skills to find specialized jobs. So the example I chose here was from Hollywood in the US. which is where you go in the US to film video or movies. And there's a reason that you get clustering of industries like this. It's because it's very specialized skill to be able to shoot films, edit films. And when people are close together, it's faster for companies to match with good workers. The last benefit people talk about for cities is learning. And this can have a number of meanings. It can be learning for individuals, right? It's easier to aggregate together in schools and educate the youth when you're in one space. It can also be learning from companies. So I chose an example here from the Silicon Valley in the US, which has been a well-studied example of sort of corporate learning. So you have this amazing network of technology companies that, while they're competing with each other, also learn from each other, and workers share tips informally. And so there's a knowledge economy, a knowledge ecosystem that is shared. So for these reasons and many more reasons, cities are quite positive. So I think the way to think about this big urbanization is not that it's something we want to get rid of, but as something we need to manage to have a sustainable planet in the future. All of those benefits of cities come from interaction, right? The fact that we're close together, that we're in proximity to each other, means that interactions and transactions are faster. But there are downsides of proximity. And here I'm turning to some of the challenges of a world where we all live in cities. The picture on the left is rush hour in New York City, in Penn Station, which I think is one of the ugliest big train stations in the world because it's all underground. And so you can get a sense in this picture how fast everyone's moving and also how claustrophobic life in a big city can be. And studies show that this is the case. So levels of stress go up for people in cities. And that could be stress from interacting with other people, or stress from noise, or stress from light pollution. And going along with stress, there are higher levels of depression, schizophrenia, other types of psychoses, and higher levels of different attention deficit disorders. So in a really real sense, we're creating this urban world for ourselves. It lets us interact with other people, which in some ways is what people are about, right? Aristotle called us the social animal, but it also stresses us out. In some ways, our cities are not very humane for the way our organism is designed. The slide on the right gives you a sense of just how widespread this phenomenon is. This is some of my own work. So I classified the cities of the world into the neighborhoods of different cities of the world into population density categories. And that's what the bars represent. And the axis on the left just shows you how many billions of people live in each of those categories. So you can see that we actually live at fairly close proximity to each other. In red here is the incidence, the rates of several mental health disorders. And so you can see, this is from some work from some Swedish researchers, Sundquist and colleagues. So you can see that as we get into higher population densities, there's more incidence of disease. And so we are, in a quantitative sense, living at a density that is hard for people sometimes to mentally accommodate to. And of course, cities have many other environmental challenges that they face. I will not have time in this talk to highlight all of them, but I wanted to highlight just one of them. This is a picture from New Delhi in India. And this is a fairly typical bad air day in New Delhi. You can see the sun just barely peeking through there. So the majority of folks who live in cities where particulate matter concentrations exceed WHO guidelines, for instance. So we have a lot of work to do to make our cities healthier places on a number of fronts, right? Mentally and physically healthier. So one big focus of my work is, what is the role of nature as the solution here? That is, if we're gonna all live at greater density with each other, what are the ways that we can have the benefits that cities provide, the benefits of more interaction, but still have a livable, humane space? And I wanted to illustrate this with the picture here on the left. This is a marvelous park in Taipei. right in a fairly dense city, but you can get a sense of why this would be a big respite from a dense Asian city. And quantitatively, studies are showing us that a little bit of time in nature alleviates a lot of the burden of added stress or added depression. So what I've done here is, in the picture on the right, this is some of my own work, classified all the neighborhoods and cities all around the world into how much forest cover do they have? Is it 5%, 10%, 15%? And then the percent of urban dwellers globally who are sort of in that category. So you can see most people have 10 to 15% forest cover nearby, which is actually not that much. And then in green here, I'm showing you some of the results from an interesting study. This particular one was from the UK, I think, that's showing that when you get above a certain threshold of forest cover, you have less depression, less stress, better mental health outcomes. So one of the challenges I want to put to you all is, how can we design these cities that we're so fast, so rapidly building, so that we get a little bit more of these mental health benefits of nature? And nature, of course, provides many more benefits. So this chart talks just about urban trees. There, you could put up a similar chart for parks and other kinds of nature. But you can see this whole gamut of benefits, everything from cleaning the air to cooling the air to managing stormwater to helping encourage physical activity. So I hope I convince you by the end of my talk here that even in this urban century that we're living in, this period of the most rapid urban growth in human history, we still need a little bit of nature to make those cities thrive. So I'm going to talk just about a couple of those benefits in more detail, highlighting a bit of my work and a bit of the Nature Conservancy's work. And I'd love, in the question and answer period, to hear more about what WBFF is doing in Europe, because I'm still learning. This is a park near New York City, where we work on these issues of cooling the air through planting trees. So I guess I wanted to start with some context of why this issue is so important. We are already living in a world of climate change, where heat waves are more intense and more frequent than before. Europe has had a number of really big heat waves. Just in 2019, there was a large heat wave, and I grabbed a map here from some of the European agencies showing the surface temperature anomaly for this really hot period in June, which extended certainly to Switzerland, but especially in central France. So events like this are sort of going to be the new normal, and we have to adapt our cities to them. So areas in red here are, 7 or 8 degrees Celsius above normal. So quite a hot event. When you review the literature and the empirical measurements, having a row of street trees, like you see on the left, reduces average summer temperatures by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. So you can see there, I want to temper my remarks a little bit. You can see that trees are not going to solve all of the challenge, but they can certainly make a public space more livable, and they can reduce, the effect of a heat wave by 25% or so. A lot of my work is working with epidemiologists and health professionals to quantify the benefits of trees to preventing deaths and preventing disease during heat waves. So one study I just finished showed that in the United States, just the US, trees save about 1,200 lives a year because they cool the air during heat waves. And there's a lot more potential for trees to clean and cool the air going forward. All right, so now I'm going to talk more about that cleaning the air piece. This is an example from Louisville, Kentucky, a city probably not too well known outside the US. It's famous for horse racing and also bourbon, which is a type of alcohol, but a city of a couple million people. And our focus in that work in Louisville and in a number of other places is about the role that trees can play in reducing particulate matter pollution. So particulate matter is dangerous to human health when you inhale it and it gets into your lungs. And the very small particles can get into your bloodstream. Trees and their leaves serve as surfaces for the particles to settle out on So just like dust settles out on the furniture in your house, leaves will help remove some of the particulate matter from the air. This is a local solution. It really works kind of just downwind of the trees. And I want to acknowledge that it doesn't solve the ultimate problem, right? We need to find a way to reduce our overall pollution from cars and smokestacks. But just like it's helpful sometimes to wear a mask on a really bad air day, trees help filter and particularly for sensitive spaces can have a big benefit. So what we've been trying to do in the Nature Conservancy is two things. We want to understand how much trees are already providing benefits to cities around the world in terms of cleaning their air. This is work we did in collaboration with C40. And also understand where you would plant trees to get the biggest benefit. So the map on the left here shows the city where I am currently, Washington, DC, sort of street by street, what would be the return on investment in removing particulate matter. And so you get the highest return on investment in places where people are living fairly densely. They don't have much trees now. And people often are in vulnerable populations. So people with asthma or other pre-existing conditions. And so targeting can be really important when you talk to a city, because the benefits of trees planting for air quality might be 1,000 times more in the center part of DC than it would be in one of the outlying suburbs. And we can do this now, ecologists can do this for hundreds of cities. So to return to the Louisville example, what we're doing in Louisville, which I think is really cool, is working with some money from the National Institutes of Health in the US and the University of Louisville Medical School. And we have a control neighborhood and an intervention neighborhood. So in the control neighborhood, we're just tracking the health of citizens, focusing especially on cardiovascular health and some biomarkers of blood stress and exposure to air pollution. And then in the intervention neighborhood, we're really dramatically greening the neighborhood. This is sort of a conceptual figure where the green dots show where we might plant lots of trees. This is a decade-long experiment, but we're going to really see, okay, if we plant all these trees, are we getting the benefit we think we're going to get to public health? There's been a lot of empirical measurements that show trees have these health benefits, but I think this is the first neighborhood scale sort of public health experiment. All right, I'm switching to another benefit of nature here. This is the way natural features can manage stormwater. You see this in a number of cities, and there's some European cities like Freiburg and Germany that are famous actually for doing a good job managing stormwater with natural infrastructure. This is a facility in Washington, DC, where I live. And I love this picture because it's doing what it should be doing, right? It's catching stormwater and helping infiltrate into the ground. That helps Washington, DC avoid polluted rainwater running off into the stormwater system. And Washington, DC, like many other cities, has a combined stormwater and sewer system. So when we get too much rainwater, we actually dump raw sewage into the Potomac River in this case. So that's gross to have raw sewage being dumped into your river. You know, I can smell it when I go jogging by the river. It's also illegal in the US, and that kind of raw sewage release is also illegal in Europe under EU law. So cities around the world are trying to figure out how do you avoid those events, and managing your stormwater can be one way to do it. So in a sense, we're recreating little wetlands in the city. And I don't have much science to show you. I just thought I'd show you pictures from a project we're doing in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Often you want these spaces also to be multifunctional. So here, these are essentially garden spaces. And community groups can come out and use this space for gardening, but the space is also designed so that stormwater is shunted here. And during flooding periods, this space does flood. So it's both a stormwater management system and a garden for the community. You see, we work with lots of communities on setting up projects like this. So just returning, I think, to the big picture, we've shown that if cities around the world were willing to spend a little bit more on tree planting and park creation, we could save tens of thousands of lives annually, because the air would be cleaner or cooler, because we'd manage stormwater better and thus prevent the release of sewage. So we have to ask ourselves, well, why aren't we doing that? Well, cities have lots of other problems they're trying to solve, so this may not be top of mind. And there may be a lack of knowledge. Cities may not know about the potential benefits nature can provide. So that's part of the reason I give talks like this, is to spread the gospel of nature-based solutions, if you want to call it that. Because, this is what I want to end with, this is what's so important, is that we all recognize the choice facing humanity. We are building the cities of the future today, and we can choose. We can choose to create a lot more spaces like that river in Los Angeles that are gray and concrete and dark and vacant, or we can choose to have a more verdant future where our cities are still productive and still efficient, maybe still low greenhouse gas emitting, but have nature in their fabric and are a little more humane places to live that are better for our mental and physical health. I truly believe that we could have that more green future if we all want it, and that's what motivates me to come give talks to groups like this one. So thank you again for listening. And if any of this stuff is interesting, the basic idea of what I was presenting was just in this book that Tim Beatley and I wrote. And I think with that, I'll stop sharing and we can take some questions.
Thanks a lot, Rob. It was very, very interesting presentation. We got a couple of questions. One was from Melanie. Question to you: what effect do green roofs have on cities?
That's a good question. So green roofs do a couple nice things. So they are, they're helping cool that surface. So they're cooling down the area around the building. They can also help make buildings more energy efficient, right? So you can, especially in the summer, keep off some of the hot energy. So you're using less energy for air conditioning. There are other ways to do that, right? You may hear about cool roofs where people just paint roofs white. That has some of that same energy efficiency gain. But the great thing about green roofs is you're also squeezing a bit more biodiversity into cities. I'm working right now on a project where we're trying to evaluate new spaces for green roofs in Berlin, right? And a lot of the motivation is just new space for butterflies and pollinators in the city. And then there's finally a mental health benefit, right? People in the building, depending on the kind of building, can go up to the roof and they just have a new green space that they can enjoy. So it's definitely one solution, green roofs. They're expensive compared to other projects on the ground, especially if you want to have deep-rooted plants. So I think you have to think through your goals with any particular building, but definitely I see more and more cities trying to use green roofs, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. We also got another question. This one is, how do you ensure that the stormwater shunted to gardens is clean and doesn't contaminate the food? Or are they actually not vegetables gardens?
That's a really good question. So in the example I showed from Bridgeport, because of where that stormwater is coming from, we're not too concerned about it being contaminated. It's mostly coming off roofs, for instance, and not roads where you would pick up more pollutants from cars and spilled oil and stuff like that. I think you're right. It is an issue that you have to be careful about when you're growing things you're going to eat. The majority of the stormwater green infrastructure facilities we create aren't used for food production in this way, but they're more commonly green kind of for aesthetics or, wetland, sort of more natural look. And then you don't mind as much, right, if some of the pollutants accumulate in that soil. And often that's beneficial for cities rather than having those pollutants wash into the stormwater system and then wash down into a river, like the Rhine River or something. But that's a good question. You do have to think about where is the pollution going and where is it accumulating?
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Melanie as well. do you meet a lot of resistance actually when trying to make more green spaces, maybe from the government or the people? And then I would add to that, I was also thinking during your presentation, could you maybe make some, how would you call that? Some deals maybe with some government, especially, or some people, or some maybe I was thinking health insurance, who would also actually benefit from more greens in the city.
Yeah, maybe I'll work backwards to your question and then I'll answer the other one. Your comment is right. We've worked with some government agencies, like in Australia is the example that comes to mind, where we worked on an urban forestry plan for Melbourne, and then the Australian health system was really interested in what was the potential benefit to health of having more trees, and should they maybe chip in some money to the municipal authorities to create this urban forestry plan. And you see other links like that in other countries. So New Zealand is famous for having a green prescription program, right? So when patients have certain health problems, that doctors will prescribe time in nature, mostly for physical fitness benefits. So it's a challenge more in a place like the US, where we have a private health insurance system, or Switzerland, because there's many insurers, right? So there's kind of a collective action problem. So that's one challenge to answer the first question in the Q&A box. You know, one challenge is just that there's different government agencies with different goals, and to plan for nature right and overcome the barriers out there, you have to get coordination. So you have to get the people who care about health talking to the people who care about climate resilience, talking to the people who manage parks or who have a mandate to protect biodiversity. And right now in many cities, those are different agencies, also working maybe at different scales, right? One could be in the city, one could be at a canton, one could be at a country level. So there's some bureaucratic inertia. That's a big barrier that I face in a lot of my projects. There's also sometimes concerns around gentrification and affordable housing that we have to think through, right? So this is coming through now in some of our Berlin work. You know, there's an interest in the city's part in, there's a lot of vacant lots in Berlin, a lot of old industrial space. Some of those could become new parks, but some of those are also going to become more apartment buildings. And so the city has to think through, how do they both create more housing to create affordable housing, but also have some green space for people. And our principle is we always try to work with community groups who are thinking about, these partners who are thinking about both those issues, and we try to find a solution that meets both those goals. And I think you can find examples of cities that are quite dense and still have affordable housing and have green. So there are solutions that sort of let you get to both. And I find that message is really important, so that these two groups don't, fight against each other, but instead they kind of plan together to envision the city we want to live in.
Very interesting. We got two more questions. One from Jero. The World Economic Forum this year talked about biodiverse cities. Mm-hmm. How do you see the viability of designing big cities under that concept?
Yeah, so I've interacted some with those folks, and there's a number of other initiatives happening now as well to try to plan for biodiversity in cities. So the science-based targets for nature process is also thinking about cities, and IUCN has an urban alliance, for instance. There's ICLEI, of course. So the challenge in working with big cities, which is what you asked about specifically, is that, and I think this is a general challenge for urban planners, right, and urban design. You're working in an existing city that already has had a lot of decisions made, and so you often can only change, a little tweak here, a tweak there. It's very focused interventions where you put in some more nature or biodiversity when you can, or you're thinking often about the perimeter of a city, where a city is sprawling and expanding, and maybe protecting biodiversity at that edge. The situation is different when I interact with cities in India or China or in Africa, where the pace of growth is much, much faster. And so that's both a huge challenge, but it also means that, for instance, we have a project in Chennai, India. It means that, you know, Chennai in 10 years might double in size. And so decisions are being made now about where the natural areas will still be in a place like Chennai. And so there's a real opportunity to plan better in fast-growing cities like that. At least that's my hope.
Thank you. Shannon has also a question. I'm curious about how green space projects are incorporated into underprivileged neighborhoods. Are you seeing an initiative in these places, or mostly new and more wealthy urban areas?
That's a good question, and it references back to some of what I was saying about the potential conflict, maybe, right, between urban greening and gentrification. So yes, I see projects in underprivileged neighborhoods as well. To me, it's often about who are you designing a project for, and how do you make sure you're designing it for the underprivileged neighborhood that's nearby. So let me explain what I mean. Maybe with a contrary example. So I live in Washington, D.C. They redeveloped an area along the river that's called the waterfront that used to be a predominantly low-income neighborhood. And they built giant new apartment buildings and a new boardwalk along the river and new parks. But they were designed for high-income people, and the city definitely rezoned the whole section of the city to encourage that transformation of the city. And it did displace a lot of low-income households. So I think in a situation like that, you don't want to blame the parks per se. It was the fact that the people running that project for the city wanted to economically gentrify the neighborhood. And so the parks sort of went along with the big new boardwalk and the big new buildings. You know, conversely, I have seen projects in the US, Philadelphia comes to mind, where they have said, the city of Philadelphia has said, we want to identify vacant lots that were owned by the city, but they hadn't been taking care of them. There was trash in the sites. There was, no one was taking care of these vacant lots. And they restored them, they removed the trash, they increased the grass cover and the tree cover. And what's interesting is you saw some real mental health benefits for people nearby. And because these were small little pocket parks in underserved neighborhoods, they haven't driven gentrification. In fact, they were designed to help the people that were there. So to me, that's the question, is like, you should be planning for nature to help people nearby, and you want to do it in collaboration with the neighborhood residents nearby, if that makes sense. Usually that's our way of working, is to try to think of it as co-designing and kind of co-envisioning this future together.
Okay, thanks a lot. We had another question, this one from Lionel. What are the most original solutions, the most innovative concepts to introduce nature in cities where there is only concrete?
That's a good question. So first, I want to answer it with a bit of history that I find fascinating. So now there are things we take for granted, like street trees or having public parks, that we should think of as inventions, right? So if you were in a European city in 1700, there was basically no street trees anywhere, and there was basically no public parks, right? With the exception, the only green space was graveyards or maybe parks for the royal families. And so through a series of really inventions, we started to incorporate nature more into our cities. So street trees, for instance, I find the history really fascinating. The Low Country, so Amsterdam, places like that, had canals that came into the city, and there was a tradition of using trees to stabilize canal banks. And so then in Amsterdam, they started to experiment with planting street trees along streets. And it's interesting because other European cities sort of thought it was a crazy idea, right? But you fast forward a few hundred years and suddenly we have street trees everywhere. So, and the similar but complex story happened with public green space, right? So now the royal parks were opened up to the public, and now there's an expectation that cities will provide parks and green space to residents. So I guess I went through that history to say, we've invented new nature in cities in the past, and we can do it again. So green roofs are one example that's getting more and more common. Green facades is another thing you see. So more and more buildings trying to incorporate vegetation along their sides. That's still a really expensive technique, and it's arguably more for aesthetics than anything else. I mean, the other big growths in nature in cities now is trying to convert old infrastructure to green corridors. So like that work in Seoul, turning what used to be a river and then was a channelized stormwater system, and then turning that back to a river. Or in the US, there's several places where there were old railroad lines that are no longer used in cities, and then have become these linear green spaces, even if they're sunken below street level. So yeah, to me, those are some of the other ways nature can be used. Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibility. Each time that we start focusing as a society on new problems, we usually find new ways that nature can help solve some of those problems.
Okay, maybe we can get a very last one. There was actually a comment from Jack. We partly answered it, but I read it anyway. Maybe you want to answer to it as a very last question. He said 2 parts. It seems every city in Switzerland is constructing new buildings. How do we get the idea of adding trees and green space when it is in direct conflict with we need to build? It seems that there is a need for long-term planning to reduce the need of new buildings and increase green places. How do we promote that? So I guess we partly answered it, but I don't know, maybe you want still to have a last answer.
Yeah, so this is a really big interest of mine. Actually, I have a project called How Do We Get Denser and Greener for All, right? That's trying to answer this with some funding from Google, trying to understand what are neighborhoods that have done both. And I think the good news is you can have neighborhoods that are fairly dense, but still have a lot of nature in them. And the reason that matters is there will be new buildings constructed, and there's just no way to house 2 billion more people in cities without a lot of new buildings be constructed. But the shape of our cities, their form, will control how much we sprawl out and how much we impact nature. So Singapore is maybe a good example of a city, albeit in a really unique circumstance, right? It's an island, a very dense city on an island, that has gotten good at incorporating nature on almost every surface, right? On rooftops and sides of buildings and in little pocket parks. And so I don't have a concrete answer to what Jack asked, except that I think we have to avoid pitting it as sort of buildings versus nature, but instead say, well, how do we get both? And can we cluster the buildings on one part of the parcel so that we have room for nature, say, on the other part of the parcel?
Okay, thanks so much for those answers. Because of time, we will have to stop here. For the question I didn't have time to ask, we will try to answer by email. Sorry for that. And then thank again, Rob, for taking the time to answer those questions. And I will now hand over to Adriana for a short close-up. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Rob. Super interesting. Yeah, Rob, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm trying not to share my presentation again, but let's see if that works. Yay, that worked. Anyway, thank you very much for your presentation. You asked what WWF is doing. I put a link in the chat. Maybe I don't have time, I think, now to go into details. WWF has some projects mostly in France, in Italy, and in Portugal, I mean, in the European region, but then, of course, all over the world. I think the one that is more, I find the one most fascinating would be in Latin America, where it's being discussed more like having a jungle in the city instead of just like a greenery, which in that area will make a lot more sense. the other projects are also very oriented to solar energy and to stopping the CO2 emissions more than greenery. But I know that Switzerland, WWF Switzerland is looking into that and has a lot of interest in it. So hopefully we can start soon a project. But let's try and do that, Robert. When you come to Switzerland, then maybe you can help us with that. That would be really cool. So I really want to take the chance to also thank the organizers. Besides me, David was very active answering all the technical questions in Meetup and helping people join us. And thank you also, Coralie, for leading the Q&A session. That was really cool. I myself, I started with the international volunteers. I founded the group as a volunteer. Now I work within WWF, leading the corporate volunteering program and keeping my nose in the international volunteers, trying to help here and there. As Coralie said, we'll try and get you the answer to the question that was missing. We'll look at it with Rob. And now this thing doesn't want to continue. Let me try. Exactly. Please try and connect with us through social media. You find us in Instagram, in Facebook, in LinkedIn, and in YouTube. In YouTube, we will post as well the recorded session for those who joined a little bit later, so that you can also get the beginning of Robert's conference. Also in our social media, you can like and join our campaigns for Meatless Mondays, and Alltag, Freitag, and many other campaigns that we have every now and then, also on littering in the cities. Sorry, the presentation is a little bit slow. But the upcoming event that we have, we just closed a very nice campaign on littering, mostly on from cigarette butts, and the damages of cigarette butts in water bodies and overall for nature, and I mean for animals, and for all cells. Sorry, I'm mixing now German. Anyway, we are supporting a campaign, Stop to Drop, which is a campaign done mostly in schools, also to prevent smoking in the youth, and also letting them know what is the harms of dropping cigarette butts on the street. We're going to be joining that campaign, and on the 13th of March we are going to be offering an online cleanup. This means that you can join virtually for some inputs from our expert Gabi, and then you can go out and collect trash, and among that also the cigarette butts, and then we'll tell you what to do with them to contribute to this very cool campaign. This will be done in Zurich, Zug, and I think now Basel as well. But stay tuned in our meetup, and you'll get more information there. You'll be able to register there, so that we send you the link also on time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, for participating, for the very cool questions. Rob, thank you very much for the very interesting conversation. And well, we look forward to have you here in Switzerland, Rob, and to all of you to have you again in one of our events. I wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Bye all.
Bye.